everyone, welcome to today's webinar, 5 Best Practices of 21st Century Business Planning, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Kendra Ravoy, Marketing Specialist with 3esi-Enersight. Here with me today is your presenter, Wayne Keinick, who is the Product Manager for Business Planning Solutions at 3esi-Enersight. As a Product Manager, Wayne is responsible for ensuring that all 3esi-Enersight solutions meet the critical needs of our global client base. Wayne's past experience includes technical consulting, training, business development, and sales, and he brings this valuable experience to all of his interactions with both clients and our software development teams. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Wayne for today's presentation.
Hello everyone, and thanks Kendra for that introduction. And thank you to everyone for joining us for today's webinar, 21st Century Planning, 5 Critical Practices. We're excited to have all of you today to join us for what promises to be a great discussion. As already mentioned, my name is Wayne Keinick, and I'm going to be your presenter today. A little bit about myself. I have worked for 17+ years in the upstream oil and gas industry. 15 of those years have been spent specifically in software, focused in the areas of planning, economics, production forecasting, budgeting, and decision analysis. Over those years, I've had the privilege to work with hundreds of great clients to observe what works and what does not work when it comes to EMP planning. Now, the planning process in upstream oil and gas can look quite different across companies of differing sizes, resource type, strategic approach, and other factors. However, when one steps back, there are distinct characteristics that contribute to building relevant, achievable, and defensible plans that are aligned to your business priorities. Today's webinar is going to explore those distinct characteristics, 5 critical practices which I believe are fundamental to 21st century planning. To set the stage for our discussion today, I'd like to give a quick overview about what we're going to be talking about. We will be discussing best practices for 21st century planning, but to start things off, it makes sense to give some context as to what planning used to be, and in some cases still is, and then contrast that against what planning can be in our modern environment. I'll then get into the heart of the webinar with the 5 best practices, namely exploration of relevant scenarios, understanding the required level of detail, leveraging current performance of how you're doing today, ensuring plans are based on sound economic fundamentals, and finally, functional integration across departments, including planning. Following that, we'll have a brief wrap-up and open up for discussion. Now, regarding any discussion or questions that you may have, please feel free to enter any of those into the chat window that you see on the screen now. We will, however, hold off answering those questions to the end where we've allotted time to address them. So to set some context for today's discussion, it's worth defining what we are referring to regarding the EMP planning process. Standard planning processes really include these 4 key activities: taking stock of all existing and potential projects available to the company, selecting which projects to invest in, which to divest, and perhaps which to put on hold, determining the timing for the selected projects, analyzing the predicted performance of those selected projects against any corporate goals and metrics you may have. Now, this displayed list is not meant to be exhaustive, nor are the tasks only performed sequentially. Quite often, the above is done in more of an iterative fashion. Projects are analyzed, selected, and measured against objectives, and the overall plan is then tweaked over maybe a 2-week to even 3-month period. However, this list does help us distinguish what we are referring to in the EMP planning process in comparison to other workflows in your organization. Now that we have some context for what is meant by planning, we can explore how planning has changed over time. Planning in the past. Although planning processes themselves can and will look different across companies, there are certain common shared characteristics that stand out. And a lot of them are not great. First, there was the idea of planning being an afterthought and perhaps even an unprioritized process. This may have stemmed from a number of factors. One being that of a much stronger economic environment in the oil and gas industry. Although higher commodity prices are no longer present, it makes sense that when prices and margins were higher, there would have been less emphasis or even less perceived need for rigorous planning processes to ensure success or mitigate risk. Planning also used to be quite time-consuming. Gathering information from various stakeholders, operations, exploration, and finance used to take a long time. An average petroleum engineer was asked to be an Excel expert and a data gatherer. Consolidating, validating, and analyzing the information were tedious tasks that took away from the exciting revenue-generating activities like drilling and producing the wells. Because it was time-consuming to get the information, then the logical solution was to shortcut it and get broader, less detailed information. But with less details, one also loses the opportunity for insight. Less details leads to simply going with one's gut. Now, while our industry is full of seasoned, knowledgeable, and many downright brilliant minds, going with one's gut is never a great substitute for the tangible and accurate data, the cold hard facts you have. Now, at this point, if that plan was not a high priority, it may not have had much detail and potentially was based on many back-of-the-envelope type analyses, it should come as no surprise that there would be a lack of accountability for that plan. In other words, who would bother looking at a plan to track progress if the plan itself was not based in any sense of reality? Finally, these last 2 points speak mainly to a general lack of input, collaboration, and understanding across all vested parties. The planning process, by its definition, deals with entities down to the level of wells, plants, fields, and also connects these to corporate metrics such as capital budget, production targets, and others. In other words, the planning process needs to link across multiple levels of an organization, and in the past, this either didn't happen or was painful to implement. Contrasting the old way with today's planning process demonstrates an improvement, and in some cases, the complete opposite of the former list. The process itself is efficient and rapid. Less time is spent on collecting and validating data, while more is spent on analysis and insight. This efficiency enables the transition from a once-a-year, build-it-from-scratch type process to an evergreen model that is constantly updated as new information is available. The plan is integrated from many perspectives. The data is shared across departments and people, and the plan has input from various stakeholders. This creates a collaborative plan that everyone can defend and everyone can work with. Our industry's ability to evolve from the planning processes of old to 21st century planning can be attributed to a few key factors. Obviously, industry market conditions have forced the search for these efficiencies across all aspects of the oil and gas industry. Technology, namely software, and those related tools have evolved to support efficient workflows. The 5 critical best practices that I'll speak to were not practical and were nearly impossible without these advancements in both software and process. Let's get into those 5 critical practices in a little more detail. The first critical practice I want to discuss is the thorough exploration of all relevant scenarios. Now, this can be broken down into 2 key components: creation and analysis of those scenarios. For creation, the key is having the ability and the time to generate the scenarios. This is not about simple data entry, but is referring to a bigger picture. A typical planning scenario might be running all projects against several different price forecasts. That scenario itself may involve multiple nuances and project tweaks to get an accurate assessment for each price forecast. Another may involve accelerating, delaying, or canceling certain projects. Again, this could involve tweaks to projects to get a complete picture. The second component, analysis, involves the vetting and scrutiny around those scenarios. This really requires a significant amount of time for planners and engineers and others to actually think with the data in order to provide value-add analysis. And in the past, most of that time was chewed up in the scenario creation with very little time left over. As one can see, these 2 components form a symbiotic relationship. The planning team needs the ability to create meaningful scenarios, but they need this ability to be time efficient so that the time savings can be allotted to the analysis of those scenarios. So what are scenarios actually worth? Well, at first glance, the value of thorough scenario analysis may be difficult to see. However, in a recent SPE paper presented at Heath, Portfolio Optimization in High and Low Risk Environments, the authors focused on exploring different portfolios and different business scenarios for a major U.S. shale producer. The corporate environment in the before state of the case study was not so dissimilar to what many companies experience today. Upper management would set targets in terms of production, capital budget, rig resources, and ultimately capital efficiency. However, the company's previous workflow really only allowed for one main portfolio or plan to be submitted. And although the plan was pretty good, it still fell short on a few parameters. After revising the workflow to allow for more relevant plans and scenarios, they were able to, first, examine more scenarios in detail. Secondly, compare and contrast those to understand the trade-offs of metrics required, the capital investment, and then ultimately come up with a scenario that actually came much closer to meeting the management's targets. In fact, by reducing time for gathering the data and increasing the time for analysis, the new revised scenario they built was able to exceed the original plan submission by almost 25%. With all of those scenarios now available, the next challenge becomes how much detail to put into each. Each planning scenario is likely made up of multiple projects. With hundreds or potentially thousands of projects, the challenge of data granularity can be mind-numbing. Adding further fuel to this fire is the timing of when that data is needed. Considering the amount of data, planning teams are faced with a Goldilocks-type dilemma of having too much or not enough, but ultimately are searching for what is just right. One extreme is to take a Rube Goldberg-like approach and throw everything available into it. These scenarios will definitely have a ton of detail and a ton of complexity. This can provide some comfort of accuracy, but it can also dramatically slow down the process. One can always speed up the process by sacrificing details, but at what point are those results not only inaccurate, but also directionally incorrect? Timing is also a factor here. Planning teams in oil and gas serve many masters, and changes in the market, such as unstable commodity prices, give everyone a reason to be nervous. Operational conditions that happen in the field may be a reason to reevaluate your plan as well. Management and/or investors may ask for a quick update to make directional type of decisions, or they may require a detailed plan with reports to back up that information. All of these situations require different levels of granularity and can come with irregular timing. With these two components of granularity and timing, there really is no right answer. It's been said that the only thing constant is change, and that holds well here. The amount of granularity and timing do not follow an ideal constant, but one can be certain that they will change. Your business planning processes need to allow for that. One of the main knocks against historical planning processes is that it was a once-a-year, one-time thing. The results and performance of the plan were never really vetted or validated. In today's planning process, the art of incorporating current performance is not a separate thing, but is in fact an integral part of the planning process. That insight into how you're doing comes in two forms. The first is making use of actual data. This can refer to things like actual production data, capital spends, operating costs, and drilling and cycle times. A good planning process will make use of actual data to update and adjust the plan going forward. The second part of this is looking at the planning process itself. That old notion of, well, this is the way we've always done it, is an idea that simply must be thrown away. The process needs to be treated like data. It is the best estimate we have so far, but it will be replaced as soon as we know better. And the elements of the process that are subject to change may come from the very topics in this presentation. For example, the granularity of the data required is something that your company must be prepared to alter as the need arises. In the past, planners either made broad assumptions to incorporate economics, or the planning cycle was significantly delayed in order to incorporate accurate economic metrics into the plan. Sometimes it was both, and this was partly due to the complexity of the economic models. But it was also due to the fact that those who understood and ran the economic models were not necessarily integral to the planning process. This type of planning can present a number of problems. Plans that are not based on current economic conditions, gross assumptions that are completely inaccurate, and extended planning cycle times, amongst others. In modern planning practices, these problems need not be issues anymore. First, in order to have a truly useful and meaningful plan, accurate economics are essential. With lower commodity prices, profit margins have become much more sensitive to slight changes and therefore can be a big influence on planning decisions. As well, the complex fiscal regimes that exist in many parts of the world do not lend themselves well to rules of thumb. It is essential that the economic models used are accurate and robust. Secondly, where economics used to be managed outside of planning, modern tools, namely software applications, are able to incorporate detailed economics into the planning process. And they do this with minimal impact to turnaround time. The planning team should now insist that when they evaluate, analyze, and run economics on their plan, that it is done using the most accurate calculations available. And this is done without having to send the plan to another team for accurate economic evaluation. In the end, this approach provides the necessary accuracy without having to sacrifice cycle time. The final best practice that I'd like to discuss is one of a more holistic nature. One of the main arguments against planning of the past was that the plans lived in isolation. The corporate planning group or individual asset team planning groups often worked in isolation. Occasionally, they would reach out to other teams for information or validation, but for the most part lived on some mysterious corporate island. Modern planning processes and the resulting plans simply must be an integral part of the company's complete business processes. The resulting plans are intended to represent the same assets that are managed and reported in the reserves group, that are actively produced and executed in operations, and that are tracked in accounting. In order for planning in those respective groups to recognize the most value, all groups need to be working integrally. When the processes are integrated, the resulting plans become defensible and grounded in reality. Defensible, as the numbers and results align with other teams within the organization. Grounded in reality, as the other groups, reserves, operations, and accounting, are very much in the world of actuals. Planning is in the world of the forecasted. The forecast is much more real when incorporating what is actually happening. Each individual team or group benefits from this integrated process. The concepts of what we have said we would do, how to do it, and what we did become much tighter when you work in this fashion. When a business planning process is truly integral and all workflows considering others, the benefits grow even more. The benefits start to show in both direct and indirect forms. As an example, consider the case below. A large EMP company has 5 major business units operating across North America. Each of the business units uses several systems to do their planning with. This includes a mixture of commercial software, homegrown or proprietary systems, and Excel. One of those business units incorporated a modern planning solution to use for their 4 planners, who, by the way, were also engineers as part of their job function. Prior to the new system and workflows, it took them approximately 5.5 man-weeks per planner to prepare and submit their planning spreadsheets, using 3 different systems in the process. This team would submit their business plan once per year using corporate standard format to form the corporate business plan. Afterwards, the team would return to their source systems and attempt to align those systems with the sanctioned plan they got back from corporate. This overall process resulted in the team spending an excessive amount of time on simply converting data from their local systems to the corporate standards and then back again. Overall, the efficiencies in both the data, migrating back and forth, and the time and effort of the employees was chewed up by simply not having a process that was integral across the organization. A more integrated application and workflow was then introduced. This new system was able to support the workflow for the different business units. It handled detailed workflow of business units and also had the ability to roll up to a corporate level. Further, it covered differing workflows from planning to economics to capital forecasting. This integrated system significantly reduced previous issues, such as the amount of data migration required, which helped cut down on loss of data or data inaccuracy. And there was significantly less time spent by users on translating and preparing data from one system to the other. Also, the burden on IT was greatly reduced by going from 3 systems down to 1. Overall, the estimated man days required by each planner was reduced from 27 to 3.5 days. Now remember, this company had 5 business units, so translate those results across all of them, and the value generating and cost savings become quite significant. The planning process has changed from what it once was. No longer is it an isolated activity carried out by a separate group once a year only to chew up precious time, be discarded, and then started over again. By employing some essential best practices, it is an integral part of the oil and gas E&P organization. The 5 best practices we discussed today can be summed up as the following. First, the ability to create all relevant scenarios while allowing for time to properly analyze and generate insight on each of those. Second, providing the right level of detail, not too much, not too little, and providing the details in response to demand, all while having the flexibility to zoom in or out on that level of detail. Thirdly, incorporating actual data to validate forecasts, reviewing processes themselves to fine-tune the planning process. The 4th practice was that the planning process can and should make use of accurate economics. With modern software applications, there is no reason to shortcut here. Finally, the planning process itself will benefit, and other corporate groups will benefit when it is an integral part of the overall business functions in your organization. Before I close out the presentation and open up for questions, I'd like to leave a final thought. Modern planning processes have evolved to become an integral and essential part of the E&P organization. Advances in technology and the availability of information help support an evergreen process that is ongoing, integrated, and invaluable to the progress of organizations, regardless of their size. With that, I'd like to thank you for attending this session today, and I'm going to hand over the floor to Kendra to facilitate any questions that have come in during the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Wayne. We're now going to take this opportunity to review some of the questions that came through. So the first question is, can I get a copy of the SPE paper you mentioned earlier?
Yes, you can. Anyone that wants a copy of the paper, simply email us after the webinar, and we can provide it for you. Alternatively, you can visit SPE's site One Petro for all published SPE papers.
Great. Second question, can I access a recording of this webinar?
Yes, the recording of this webinar and any of the associated questions are going to be made available early next week, and we'll notify all of you when it is ready.
Great. That's all the time that we have for questions right now. So if your question was not addressed, we'll be sure to get to it as soon as we can. We wanted to thank you so much for joining us today and hope to see you again soon.